When most people think of ship disasters, one name comes to mind: Titanic. But let's be honest, that story has been told more times than the ship had lifeboats. Today, we're going deeper than the obvious to uncover the vessels that should never have left the dock. These are the floating follies, the cursed contraptions, and the naval nightmares that sank under the weight of their own bad design, rotten luck, or sheer incompetence. From Sweden's sailing pride, which toppled over on its very first voyage, to a U.S. destroyer that accidentally tried to sink the president, these are ships that turned ambition into absurdity and progress into catastrophe. So hoist the anchor, and we hope you can swim, because we're about to tell the tales of 10 ships that should never have sailed. And while you're still afloat, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Tenfold Gold for more top 10s of history's strangest machines and misadventures. Number 1. The Vasa, 1628. Sweden's King Gustavus Adolphus wanted a warship so impressive it would strike fear into the hearts of his enemies. What he got instead was a seafaring embarrassment. The Vasa was built absurdly tall and top-heavy, laden with ornate carvings and bristling with cannons on every deck. The problem was simple and devastating. Her center of gravity sat far too high for a safe metacentric height, so the slightest gust could tip her dangerously. On her maiden voyage in 1628, the Vasa managed a grand total of about 20 minutes at sea. A gentle breeze caught her sails. She wobbled like a drunk at closing time and promptly heeled over in full view of Stockholm's horrified citizens. She sank less than a mile from the dock, dragging dozens of sailors down with her. For centuries, she sat at the bottom of the harbor until salvagers raised her in 1961. Today, the Vasa is a museum piece and tourist attraction, a gorgeous wooden relic and a spectacular reminder that no matter how much money or pride you throw at a project, bad design will always drag it down. Number 2. The Costa Concordia, 2012. If the Vasa was a 17th century disaster, the Costa Concordia proved that hubris at sea never really goes out of fashion. Launched in 2006, it was a gleaming Italian cruise liner the size of a floating city, fitted with restaurants, theaters, pools, and thousands of holidaymakers. But in January 2012, Captain Francesco Schettino decided to perform a sail-past salute, steering dangerously close to the Tuscan shoreline to impress locals and allegedly his dinner guests. It did not end well. The Concordia struck submerged rocks, tearing open her hull like a tin lid prized back. Within hours, the ship had capsized onto her side in shallow water. Chaos reigned as passengers scrambled for lifeboats, many leaping into the freezing sea. Dozens lost their lives in a disaster that was as avoidable as it was unnecessary. The captain did not exactly cover himself in glory either. He abandoned ship long before the evacuation was complete, later claiming he tripped into a lifeboat. Courts were not convinced. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison, and the Concordia was eventually hauled upright and scrapped. She is remembered not as a triumph of cruise luxury, but as a floating cautionary tale in poor leadership and worse navigation. Number 3. The MV Wilhelm Gustloff, 1945. By the final months of the Second World War, the Baltic Sea had become a desperate escape route. The MV Wilhelm Gustloff, once a Nazi cruise liner, was pressed into service to evacuate civilians and wounded soldiers from advancing Soviet forces. Designed to carry fewer than 2,000 people, she left port in January 1945, catastrophically overloaded with more than 10,000 crammed aboard. Refugees, nurses, children, and military personnel packed into every corridor and cabin. Not long into the voyage, a Soviet submarine fired 3 torpedoes. The ship listed sharply, panic set in, and lifeboats were nearly impossible to launch in the crowded, freezing chaos. In less than an hour, the Gustloff slipped beneath the waves, taking an estimated 9,000 lives with her. It remains the deadliest shipwreck in recorded history, more than 6 times the loss of the Titanic. Despite the scale, the disaster is relatively unknown outside maritime circles. Overshadowed by the war's wider carnage, it is often forgotten that this single sinking was a humanitarian catastrophe of unimaginable size. the Wilhelm Gustloff stands as a grim reminder of how war turns even the sea into a slaughterhouse. Number 4. The Edmund Fitzgerald, 1975. On the vast inland seas of North America, freighters like the Edmund Fitzgerald were the lifeblood of industry. At over 700 feet long, she was the pride of the Great Lakes Fleet, hauling iron ore across Lake Superior. But the lake has its own temper, and in November 1975, the Fitzgerald sailed straight into one of its worst storms. With winds howling at hurricane force and waves towering like buildings, the ship fought desperately to stay afloat. Sometime in the evening, the Fitzgerald vanished from radar. No distress call, no SOS, just silence. When searchers finally reached the area, all they found was floating debris and lifeboats smashed to pieces. The entire crew of 29 had gone down with the ship. To this day, the exact cause remains a mystery. Theories range from structural failure to rogue waves. The tragedy seared itself into cultural memory, thanks in no small part to Gordon Lightfoot's haunting ballad, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The song made the ship famous worldwide, yet the wreck speaks for itself. Even a routine voyage can become a final chapter when nature decides to show her strength. Number 5. The Batavia, 1629. The Dutch East India Company's Batavia set out for the spice trade in 1629. A sturdy vessel loaded with treasure, crew, and passengers bound for the East Indies. Her voyage was doomed from the start. A disgruntled officer, Geronimus Cornelis, was already plotting a mutiny, planning to seize the ship and its riches once they were far from help. Fate seemed to play along when the Batavia struck a reef off the coast of Australia, breaking apart and marooning the survivors on barren islands. What followed was less a rescue story and more a horror film. Cornelis seized control, turning the wrecked survivors into his private fiefdom. Over the next few months, his followers massacred more than 100 men, women, and children in brutal fashion. When survivors tried to resist, they were cut down. The bloodbath only ended when a group of loyal sailors held out long enough for a relief ship to arrive, capturing Cornelis and his men. The Batavia's wreck still lies off the Australian coast, and some of her timbers are preserved in museums. Her real legacy is the grisly tale of how greed and cruelty can turn a shipwreck into something far worse than the sea itself. Number 6. The Mary Rose, 1545. King Henry VIII wanted a flagship to showcase England's growing naval power, and the Mary Rose was his pride and joy. A heavily armed warship bristling with cannon, she served for over 3 decades before her fateful final battle in 1545. Facing the French fleet off Portsmouth, the Mary Rose turned to fire a broadside and promptly heeled over, water rushing through her open gun ports. In minutes, she was gone, taking nearly all 500 men on board with her. Theories abound. Was she too heavily loaded, mishandled by her crew, or simply unstable after years of modifications that raised her center of gravity and reduced her margin for error? Whatever the cause, the sinking happened in full view of King Henry himself, standing on the shore and watching his beloved flagship disappear beneath the waves. For a monarch who liked to style himself as Lord of the Seas, it must have been a particularly bitter humiliation. Centuries later, the Mary Rose was raised from the seabed and now sits preserved in Portsmouth. She is still a symbol of England's naval story, just not in the way Henry intended. Number 7. The SS Eastland, 1915. The SS Eastland was meant to be a sturdy passenger steamer, ferrying people up and down the Chicago River. On the 24th of July 1915, she was loaded with more than 2,500 Western Electric employees and their families for a company picnic. But the ship had a reputation for being unstable, so much so that locals called her the Old Tub. After the Seamen's Act tightened lifeboat requirements, alterations and added weight raised her center of gravity. An already tender vessel became even more treacherous. Within minutes, the Eastland listed to port, rolled over, and capsized right there at the pier. More than 800 people were lost in the disaster, many trapped below decks in shallow water, while crowds on the riverbank looked on in shock. Rescue attempts were frantic but chaotic. Some survivors clawed their way out through smashed windows, while others drowned just a few feet from dry land. The Eastland became a grim joke among sailors, a ship that could not even make it out of the harbor before ending the day on her side. If there were prizes for maritime incompetence, she would have won them all, and they would have been the only awards she ever won. Number 8. The Andrea Doria, 1956. The Andrea Doria was Italy's crown jewel of post-war luxury travel, sleek, elegant, and kitted out with modern comforts. She carried movie stars, aristocrats, and wealthy tourists across the Atlantic in style. But on the foggy night of 25 July 1956, she sailed straight into her destiny, and another ship. Off the coast of Nantucket, radar confusion and poor communication brought the Andrea Doria on a collision course with the Swedish liner Stockholm. Out of the mist, the smaller ship rammed her broadside, tearing a hole like a knife through silk. Passengers awoke to the sound of metal screaming and alarms blaring as the great liner began to list sharply. The heavy list left some lifeboats unusable, which added to the chaos of the evacuation and the urgency of rescue from nearby vessels. Thanks to the rapid response of other ships and organized lifeboat work, most people escaped, though 46 passengers and crew were lost. The once proud Andrea Doria rolled onto her side before slipping beneath the waves. The wreck now rests on the seabed, nicknamed the Mount Everest of diving. For a ship built to embody glamour, she ended her days as a ghostly ruin in the dark. Number 9. The SS Great Eastern, 1858. When Isambard Kingdom Brunel designed the Great Eastern, he wanted nothing less than the biggest ship the world had ever seen. At nearly 700 feet long, built of iron and 5 times larger than any vessel afloat, she was a staggering feat of Victorian engineering. People said she was so enormous she could circle the globe without refueling. She was meant to be the future of travel, a steel colossus that would shrink the oceans. She even featured a double hull and cell-like compartments that were ahead of their time for safety. The Great Eastern quickly earned another reputation, that of a cursed ship. During construction, a boiler explosion ended the lives of several workers. At her launch, she was so heavy she got stuck on the slipway for months, requiring an absurdly complicated pulley system just to shift her into the water. On her first passenger voyage, a steam explosion ripped through her decks, ending yet more lives and scaring off customers. Every attempt to run her as a liner bled money, and she became known as a floating white elephant. Eventually, she was reduced to laying telegraph cables, a humbling second career for a ship built to rule the waves. Then she was scrapped at a loss. Bigger was not better here. It was simply a bigger, costlier headache. Number 10. The USS William D. Porter, 1943. Every fleet has its problem child, and for the U.S. Navy in the Second World War, it was the destroyer William D. Porter. From the moment she launched, she seemed unlucky. On her very first assignment, escorting President Franklin D. Roosevelt's battleship, the Porter accidentally dropped a live depth charge into the ocean, nearly blasting the convoy. As if that were not enough, she then managed to launch a live torpedo directly at Roosevelt's ship during exercises. It missed, but you can imagine the panic in the White House when the message reached shore. Things did not improve. She fired on friendly aircraft by mistake, suffered constant mechanical breakdowns, and generally earned a reputation as the Navy's resident disaster. Sailors in the Pacific used to joke that if anything exploded unexpectedly, the William D. Porter must be nearby. Her career finally ended in 1945 when a Japanese kamikaze aircraft narrowly missed the Porter but detonated underwater near the ship. The shockwave fatally compromised the hull. Miraculously, every crew member survived, and she went down with no loss of life. A fittingly chaotic end for a vessel that caused more trouble for her allies than for the enemy. And there you have it, 10 ships that should never have left the dock, let alone braved the open seas. From the Vasa, which toppled over in front of a stunned Stockholm crowd, to the William D. Porter, a destroyer that spent its career behaving like a slapstick sketch, these tales show that the ocean is merciless, and human ambition is not always matched by human competence. What stands out is the variety. Some ships were too big, Some were unstable from the keel up. Others were cursed by bad leadership, bad luck, or bad timing. Not one of them is remembered for triumph. All of them are remembered for the chaos they left behind. If you enjoyed this voyage through maritime mayhem, like, share, and subscribe to Tenfold Gold. Drop a comment as well. Which of these doomed vessels would you have least wanted a ticket for? And if this floats your boat, keep an eye on the channel. We might just take a whistle-stop tour of the railways next.